Hey everyone, so for today's lecture we're going to be looking at the outbreak of World War II. This is the most destructive war in human history. In 6 years of fighting, 60 million people will be left dead. The war will be introduced to huge atrocities and countries will be left in rubble. So the Second World War begins with the invasion of Poland on September 1st, 1939. So having negotiated a treaty with the Soviet Union, Hitler felt emboldened to launch an assault on Poland under false pretense of a Polish aggression. So on September 1st, Nazi forces invaded Poland. 2 weeks later, Soviet forces invaded eastern Poland from the other side. You can see that in this map here. So Poland was overran by the Allies, the Soviet Union, and Germany, and quickly overtaken. 3 days after Germany invaded Poland, England and France declared war against Germany. They had told them did not expand anymore after Czechoslovakia and Austria. The Germans did expand into Poland, and so England and France declared war on Germany. The United States, having passed the Neutrality Acts in 1936, actually changed it to a program of cash and carry. This was passed by the Congress and basically said that the United States could aid countries at war as long as they were not on their own ships and they were paid directly in cash. This was a way that President Roosevelt and Congress got around the ability to aid France and Great Britain. Germany was able to quickly overtake Poland and quickly turned around to the west to face France. The Germans used a new form of warfare called Blitzkrieg, which is translated from German means lightning war. So the idea behind Blitzkrieg is to avoid the pitfalls and avoid the disaster of the First World War where they end up in trenches. And so they use mechanized warfare as far as tanks, armored vehicles, airplanes to move the front quickly, to move very quick, to not get dragged down. And this worked wonderfully for the Germans against France, and they were able to overtake France quickly in the Second World War. So using Blitzkrieg, this lightning war, Germany is able to quickly advance through Norway, Denmark, Belgium, and France. They're able to go through the areas where they were bogged down in the First World War and basically follow a similar line to their goals in World War I, but reach Paris this time and overtake France. You can see here a picture of Hitler in Paris in front of the Eiffel Tower. This is in 1940, Paris falls, and Paris and France will be occupied by the Nazis until 1944. So Blitzkrieg is a really successful adaptation of warfare for the Germans. The Germans are looking like the most powerful army in the world. So one of the more fateful battles is the Battle of Dunkirk in 1940. So what happens is after Germany declares wars, they strike France. The British Expeditionary Force, British soldiers move into northern France and are cut off by the German army. They are cut off and have to be evacuated by small vessels, by civilian forces, and it's evacuation of over 400,000 troops. They left a lot of equipment behind, and Great Britain had enough supply left to only supply soldiers with 2 rounds of ammunition. So this is a disaster in a lot of ways. Britain is cut off. They cannot fight the German army, but in a way it is a victory because they were able to get off the continent of Europe and head back to Great Britain with their army pretty much intact. So they're able to escape complete defeat by the Germans. So having evacuated from France and leaving pretty much the continent of Europe left to Nazi domination, the British army and the British people hunker down for what is known as the Battle of Britain. This is in 1940. This is a campaign by Nazi Germany, a campaign by the Luftwaffe, the German Air Force, to bomb Britain, and then eventually they wanted to invade Britain, but they launched a strategic bombing campaign targeting British military sites and particularly British cities. So 23,000 British civilians are killed in the Battle of Britain. The U.S. in their role actually did everything it could to keep Great Britain alive, short of going to battle. So the United States really wants Britain to remain in the war. If Britain falls, Germany will have a foothold pretty much on the entire continent of Europe. So what the United States does, it begins supplying the British. And one of those agreements is the basis for ships agreements. In this, the United States gave Great Britain 50 destroyer class battleships in exchange for land throughout the British Empire. It also enacts the Selective Service Act. That is, it calls for there might be a time when people could be drafted into the United States Army. So the people of Britain are left with a fear of unsafe skies, or fear of the German Air Force bombing, these bombing raids to try to destroy their will, destroy their morale. And here we have a quote from Winston Churchill, who is the British Prime Minister during the Second World War. And Churchill kind of represents that British resolve, the British will to keep going. And here's a quote from him. It says, "The whole fury and might of the enemy must very soon be turned on us. Hitler knows that we will have to break us in this island or lose the war. If we can stand up to him, all Europe may be free. But if we fail, then the whole world, including the United States, will sink into the abyss of a new dark age." So this kind of shows how dire the situation is for Britain, but also for the world. The idea that if Britain falls to Nazi Germany, it could be a new dark age for the world, but they do persevere. Here you can see a couple pictures from the Battle of Britain. You can see on the left, you can see a guy looking out with binoculars, looking for enemy airplanes, looking for an air raid, looking for bombers to come in to try to attack the city of London. And then you can see there on the right, you can see the aftermath of a bombing raid with the city on fire. And so Britain really has to fight for their survival. You could see that man looking out for airplanes, looking out for air raids. They would launch sirens. They would have giant spotlights to try to find German bombers. And the British Air Force fought valiantly as well. But for civilians, people lived and slept in the subway underground. Children separated from their parents moved to the countryside. The countryside was safer than living in the city because the Germans were targeting the cities. Here's a picture of English refugees coming to the United States, coming to New York City. If you look, they're all children. They've been taken away from their parents. Parents are often left in London in the urban centers, which are under attack, and they've sent their children to the United States to escape the German bombings. Here you can see two depictions of the German bombing raids. On the left, that is actually a bus in a city street which had been bombed. You can see the rubble, the destruction from the German bombs. And then on the right, you can see a boy sitting out on the steps out front of a bombed out bookstore. So he's reading a book. Everything's been destroyed, but the destruction, but the resolve of the British people really kept them through this. They kept going, even in the fear of what was happening every day. And you could see that summed up, and the British people persevere here. You can see the rubble on the streets. You can see the fireman with his hat, the air raid warden. These men go around, they blow horns, they warn people. But the shopkeeper is writing business as usual, saying that although things have been bombed out, you can see his windows have been bombed out, there's rubble on the streets. He's saying that, no, British business as usual. We're British. We're going to keep going. We're not going to let some bombs stop us. Here's a depiction from the subway, what is known as the Tube in Great Britain. Here are people who slept underground from protection from German bombing raids. Germans would often bomb at night under the disguise of darkness, and so people would go and sleep in the subways at night so they could actually sleep. So you could see kind of that resolve of the British people. You can see the people laying down on the tracks with their newspapers, laying down. They're surviving. So by 1941, it becomes evident that the United States is really close to entering the war. FDR at home, Roosevelt pushes through a program known as Lend-Lease. This is going to be a program where the United States gives military aid, direct aid to Great Britain. And the idea is that they're going to lend the stuff and Britain can pay them back at a later date. So they're pretty much arming Great Britain at this point. And so you have the cash carry replaces the Neutrality Act. Cash carry is replaced by basis for ship. And then Lend-Lease replaces that to where the United States is pretty much all in aiding Great Britain. And the way that FDR defends this is with the fire hose analogy. So FDR says, imagine that your neighbor's house is on fire. What if that fire is burning so bad that it's going to catch your house on fire? And you have a brand new fire hose. Wouldn't you lend that fire hose to your neighbor? Wouldn't you help your neighbor put out their fire with your brand new fire hose? So in the idea of the United States, that's food, supplies, weapons, military supplies. And so basically saying that this fire that's happening in the Battle of Britain, this could spread to the rest of the world. And so we have to help put out that fire. FDR also lines lays out his ideas for what the United States needs to defend. And this is in the Four Freedom speech. The United States needs to defend the freedom of speech, the freedom of religion, the freedom from want, that is hopelessness, the freedom from needing things, and the freedom from fear. So that is what the United States should stand for. So the nature of the war and the programs in the United States start to have people moving away from isolationism. There begins to be growing opposition to staying out of the war. You can see that in the depiction here, the cartoon. So you see the American First policy reading Adolf the Wolf, the children's book, and the children looking on. It says, and the wolf chewed up the children and spit out their bones. But those were foreign children, and it didn't matter. The idea here is that the children are afraid. They're like, well, this is happening. This could happen to us. They see the problems of Nazi Germany, and so the United States begins to realize that they are probably going to get involved. So the situation becomes even more dire because in June of 1941, Nazi Germany invaded their supposed ally, the Soviet Union. So they'd been allies. The Soviet Union did not think this was going to happen, but Germany was on an expansionist track. They had fought the Russians in the First World War, and they thought they could quickly overtake the Russians. So in 1941, Germany declares war on the Soviet Union and invades Russia. So as the German army moves eastward, first into Poland and then into Eastern Europe and the Soviet Union, they encounter large Jewish populations throughout this area. The German Nazi regime is a racist regime. It wants to get rid of Jews. It does not want to have Jews in their country. And so there's actually a small amount of Jews in Germany proper, but as they move into the east, they encounter larger populations. So as they're fighting a war, it becomes a situation where the Germans are trying to figure out what to do with the Jewish population here. Do they try to deport them? Do they put them into areas and ignore them? And what they come up with is the horrific idea of the final solution. The final solution is the extermination of the Jewish race. So what happens is they build concentration camps. They begin executing people. And you see that here. You see the depiction on the left of a man starving to death in a concentration camp. And you see on the right, you see German SS soldiers executing a baby. It's horrific. It is where some of the worst atrocities of the war, and it has left scars on the world. But the final solution is the idea that solving the Jewish problem is to exterminate the Jewish race. So while war is raging in Europe, in 1941, the United States is arming Britain in the Lend-Lease program. The Japanese Empire launches a sneak attack on Pearl Harbor on December 7th, 1941. The Japanese fleet moves off Pearl Harbor and launches attacks that leave 2,403 American soldiers dead, sinks several ships. In Pearl Harbor, Pearl Harbor is the main naval base for the U.S. Navy in the Pacific. So the Japanese were hoping that by sneak attacking Pearl Harbor, they could knock the Americans out of the war and thereby avoid having to fight them, thereby they could consolidate their empire in Asia without American interference. FDR goes on and quotes to address the nation, says that December 7th, 1941 is a date that will live in infamy, and states that powerful and resourceful gangsters have banded together to make war upon the whole human race. So as a result of the attacks on Pearl Harbor, the United States declares war on the Japanese Empire and the Axis powers. Remember, Japan is allied with Germany and Italy at this point. So the United States declares that it is now at war with the Axis powers. So rather than just giving arms to Great Britain, they are now going to enter the war. And so FDR says that we are now in this war. We are all in it, all the way. Every single man, woman, and child is a partner in the most tremendous undertaking of our American history. So he is committing all the resources to the United States, saying that you have provoked us, we will now go to war. And General Yamamoto of the Japanese Navy is quoted after the attacks on Pearl Harbor as saying, "I fear all we have done is awaken a sleeping giant and fill him with terrible resolve. So Yamamoto looks at the attack and says, I think we've just poked the beast. I think the United States is this powerful industrial nation that is going to be able to raise up, and they're going to be very difficult to fight. So the United States declares total war on the Axis powers. So let's go over a quick summary of what's happened since the rise of fascism up until the United States declaring war on the Axis powers. So really what you see in the 1930s is kind of evil, nasty, scary fascists. Italy, Nazi Germany, Imperial Japan wanting to take over the world. They are trying to expand their empires through military power. The United States could have been tough in response to these expansions. The idea is that such a terrible war happened in World War One. These countries are arming themselves militarily. They are trying to expand beyond their borders. The United States could look at this and say, hey, we have the military power, we have the industrial power to meet these expansions. Maybe we should try to stop this. But that's not what they did. Instead, the United States is wimpy in a lot of ways. After World War One, the United States draws back into itself, becomes isolationist, does not want to get involved in foreign conflicts, does not want to be drawn into a war in Europe. And so as these fascist nations are expanding, are looking more threatening militarily, the United States continues to say, hey, we are over here, we're just going to chill. However, as things begin to escalate, it becomes clear that the United States could be threatened. The U.S. begins to help its allies after Poland was invaded and World War II began. So the United States actually does not get involved in the war for 2 years when it's raging in Europe, from 1939 to 1941. But they are giving supplies to Great Britain. They are using the Lend-Lease program to try to defeat Nazi Germany or try to keep Britain in the war because they are worried about this. They see Nazi expansion as maybe not stopping in the continent of Europe. And then finally what happens on December 7th, 1941 at Pearl Harbor, it's really like the Hulk in a comic book or in a movie. The United States is provoked and gets angry and becomes a huge military power. So the United States, following the attacks on Pearl Harbor, will become maybe the greatest military in human history. The expansion and the growth of United States military power in this war and after is unprecedented.